we will continue with the Christmas story. Today's story is called A Christmas Miracle. It was December 23, 1910, and a plague of diphtheria swept through eastern Czechoslovakia that Christmas season. In the tiny village of Velký Slavkov, lying in the shadow of the high Tatra mountains, a solitary man walked a deserted street, pushing his hat lower on his head against the bitter wind. The man pressed ahead, passing homes with drawn shades and tightly shuttered windows. For weeks, diphtheria, an acute infectious disease that strikes the upper respiratory system, had ravaged the small towns along the foothills of the Tatra region. Nearly half the townspeople of Velký Slavkov had fallen to the plague. Many of the victims were young children less than 10 years of age, carrying a pail of black paint. The men climbed a flight of outdoor stairs and swabbed an X on the wooden doorpost of the Boratkova household. Another home was quarantined. After the man left, Susanna Boratkova kneeled at her doorpost, weeping and praying in Slovak. In less than a week, she and her husband, Jano, were suddenly childless. Their oldest child, 5-year-old Malena, had succumbed to the disease a few days earlier. In the backyard, Jano labored in the woodshed, pounding the last nail into a coffin. He was building for his 2 sons, who had died earlier that day from diphtheria. Between sobs, Jano coughed and wheezed because he too had contracted the deadly plague. Susanna returned to the house. Crying in agony, she cleaned and wrapped her sons for the final time, carefully laying them into the handmade pine caskets. She and Jano lifted them onto the wagon and with a quick jerk of the reins, started the slow journey to the town cemetery. Driving the horses through the foot-high snow, Jano and Susanna braced themselves against a chilling wind that stung both body and soul. Another trip to the graveyard is more than I can bear. Susanna cried out as they passed house after house marred with the Black Death mark. The couple empathized with those families, but they didn't have the strength to offer sympathy or encouragement. They were too wrapped up in their own grief, much like the cotton muslins tightly swathed around their sons. 2 more grave sites had been dug into the frozen earth. Now all 3 children were together for eternity. Susanna, struggling through the Lord's Prayer, hugged the cold ground and wouldn't let go. Jano finally pulled her away with what little strength he had and led her back to the wagon. She clutched her empty arms and crossed them over her broken heart. She reminded herself that she would never hold her babies again. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. As Jano and Susanna re-entered their barren and branded house, they needed comfort. They needed solace from their village friends. But no one dared come near. There were no Christmas greetings. No sympathies were extended. The black X spelled death and do not enter. Their dark house was a frightful, forbidden tomb. Little high-laced brown leather shoes were still lined up against the wood stove, as they usually were when the children were tenderly tucked into the same bed. But now the large feather bed was empty and the old stucco house had never felt so cold. "I won't see another Christmas," Jano whispered weakly to his wife. "I don't think I'll see the new year in either." He pushed away the soup and bread that he could not swallow. It was as though the diphtheria had tied a noose tightly around his throat, neither allowing food nor sufficient air to sustain him. The village doctor had shrugged his shoulders when he visited Jano a few days before. He had no cure. Susanna gathered some kindling wood and lit a fire for the night, sure that her husband was about to die. Morning arrived. Jano was still alive. Snowflakes fell from a gray sky and the wind blew a white mist over the frosted windows. Susanna, exhausted from a restless night with little sleep, dipped her cloth again in cold water to cool Jano's burning fever. Then, rubbing the icy glaze off her lattice window, she fixed her eyes on the Tatra mountains. Her mind contemplated Psalm 121:1-2. "I will look to the hills from whence cometh my help." Suddenly her gaze was interrupted as she saw a peasant woman trudging through the snow. The old woman's red and purple plaid shawl, draped over her hunched shoulders, hardly seemed warm enough against the morning chill. A babushka, or kerchief, was wrapped around her head. Her long peasant skirt was a bright display of cotton and linen patchwork, and her woolen leggings and high-button boots allowed her to successfully trod the snow-filled street. In one of her uncovered hands, she held a jar of clear liquid. Susanna stood half-stunned as she watched the old woman shuffle up the forbidden walkway. Susanna heard the knocker strike twice. She cautiously opened the door and saw an unusual face, one wrinkled from years of farm work and severe winters. But her eyes expressed a warmth that filled Susanna's heart. "We have the plague in our home, and my husband is in a fever right now." Susanna warned her. The old woman nodded and then asked if she could step inside. She held out her little jar to Susanna. "Take a clean, white linen and wrap it around your finger," she instructed. "Dip your finger into this pure kerosene oil and swab out your husband's throat, and then have him swallow a tablespoon of the oil. This should cause him to vomit the deadly mucus. Otherwise, he will surely suffocate. I will pray for you and your family." The old woman squeezed Susanna's hand and quickly stepped out to the frigid outdoors. Never before had Susanna's heart been touched in this way. Here was a poor woman appearing in love on her doorstep in the midst of a plague. Her unexpected gift was folk remedy against diphtheria. "I'll try it," she called out to the old woman, with tears in her eyes. "God bless you." Early Christmas morning, Jano retched up the deadly phlegm. His fever was broken. Susanna wept and praised God. A flicker of hope lightened her heart for a moment. Surely God would someday bless her and Jano with more children. There were no presents under a trimmed and tinseled tree that Christmas morning. But the jar of oil glimmering on the windowsill was a gift of life for generations to come. Postscript. In the days following the miraculous healing of Jano, Susanna shared the folk remedy with neighbors. In the 1920s, Jano emigrated to America to find work. Susanna joined him later with their 8 children. Their ship reached Ellis Island on Washington's birthday, February 22, 1926, and the family settled near the steel mills of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The family consisted of a set of triplets, 2 sets of twins, and 2 single births. 2 of the triplet boys were named John and Paul after the 2 sons who died from diphtheria. The other triplet was named Samuel, who today is the father of this author. God will bless you. We will continue with the Christmas story. Today's story is called A Christmas Prayer. Christmas Eve, 1881. It was Christmas Eve, 1881. I was 15 years old and feeling like the world had caved in on me, because there just hadn't been enough money to buy me the rifle that I'd wanted for Christmas. We did the chores early that night for some reason. I just figured Pa wanted a little extra time so we could read in the Bible. After supper was over, I took my boots off and stretched out in front of the fireplace and waited for Pa to get down the old Bible. I was still feeling sorry for myself, and to be honest, I wasn't in much of a mood to read scriptures. But Pa didn't get the Bible. Instead, he bundled up again and went outside. I couldn't figure it out because we had already done all the chores. I didn't worry about it long, though. I was too busy wallowing in self-pity. Soon Pa came back in. It was a cold, clear night out, and there was ice in his beard. "Come on, Matt," he said. "Bundle up good, it's cold out tonight." I was really upset then. Not only wasn't I getting the rifle for Christmas, now Pa was dragging me out in the cold, and for no earthly reason that I could see. We'd already done all the chores, and I couldn't think of anything else that needed doing, especially not on a night like this. But I knew Pa was not very patient at one dragging one's feet when he told them to do something. So I got up and put my boots back on and got my cap, coat, and mittens. Ma gave me a mysterious smile as I opened the door to leave the house. Something was up, but I didn't know what. Outside, I became even more dismayed. There in front of the house was the work team, already hitched to the big sled. Whatever it was we were going to do wasn't going to be a short, quick little job. I could tell we never hitched up this sled unless we were going to haul a big load. Pei was already up on the seat, reins in hand. I reluctantly climbed up beside him. The cold was already biting at me. When I was on, we pulled the sled around the house and stopped in front of the woodshed. He got off and I followed. "I think we'll put on the high sideboards," he said. "Here, help me." The high sideboards. It had been a bigger job than I wanted to do with just the low sideboards on. But whatever it was we were going to do would be a lot bigger with the high sideboards on. After we had exchanged the sideboards, P went into the woodshed and came out with an armload of wood. The wood I'd spent all summer hauling down from the mountain, and then all fall sawing into blocks and splitting. What was he doing? Finally, I said something. "Pa," I asked, "what are you doing?" "You been by the widow Jensen's lately?" he asked. The widow Jensen lived about 2 miles down the road. Her husband had died a year or so before and left her with 3 children, the oldest being 8. "Sure, I'd been by, but so what?" "Yeah," I said. "Why?" "I rode by just today," Pa said. "Little Jakey was out digging around in the woodpile trying to find a few chips. They're out of wood, Matt." That was all he said. And then he turned and went back into the woodshed for another armload of wood. I followed him. We loaded the sled so high that I began to wonder if the horses would be able to pull it. Finally, Pei called a halt to our loading. Then we went to the smokehouse, and Pei took down a big ham and a side of bacon. He handed them to me and told me to put them in the sled and wait. When he returned, he was carrying a sack of flour over his right shoulder and a smaller sack of something in his left hand. "What's in the little sack?" I asked. "Shoes. They're out of shoes." Little Jakey just had gunny sacks wrapped around his feet when he was out in the woodpile this morning. I got the children a little candy too. It just wouldn't be Christmas without a little candy. We rode the 2 miles to Widow Jensen's pretty much in silence. I tried to think through what P was doing. We didn't have much by worldly standards. Of course, we did have a big woodpile, though most of what was left now was still in the form of logs that I would have to saw into blocks and split before we could use it. We also had meat and flour, so we could spare that. But I knew we didn't have any money. So why was Pa buying them shoes and candy? Really, why was he doing any of this? Widow Jensen had closer neighbors than us. It shouldn't have been our concern. We came in from the blind side of the Jensen house and unloaded the wood as quietly as possible. Then we took the meat and flour and shoes to the door. We knocked. The door opened a crack and a timid voice said, "Who is it?" "Lucas Miles, ma'am, and my son Matt. Could we come in for a bit?" Widow Jensen opened the door and let us in. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The children were wrapped in another and were sitting in front of the fireplace by a very small fire that hardly gave off any heat at all. Widow Jensen fumbled with a match and finally lit the lamp. "We brought you a few things, Mom," Pa said and set down the sack of flour. I put the meat on the table. Then Pa handed her the sack that had the shoes in it. She opened it hesitantly and took the shoes out 1 pair at a time. There was a pair for her and 1 for each of the children, sturdy shoes. The best shoes that would last. I watched her carefully. She bit her lower lip to keep it from trembling, and then tears filled her eyes and started running down her cheeks. She looked up at Pei like she wanted to say something, but it wouldn't come out. "We brought a load of wood too, Mom," Pa said. He turned to me and said, "Matt, go bring in enough to last a while. Let's get that fire up to size and heat this place up." I wasn't the same person when I went back out to bring in the wood. I had a big lump in my throat, and as much as I hate to admit it, there were tears in my eyes too. In my mind, I kept seeing those 3 kids huddled around the fireplace and their mother standing there with tears running down her cheeks with so much gratitude in her heart that she couldn't speak. My heart swelled within me, and a joy that I had never known before filled my soul. I had given at Christmas many times before, but never when it had made so much difference. I could see we were literally saving the lives of these people. I soon had the fire blazing and everyone's spirits soared. The kids started giggling when Pa handed them each a piece of candy, and Widow Jensen looked on with a smile that probably hadn't crossed her face for a long time. She finally turned to us. "God bless you," she said. "I know the Lord has sent you. The children and I have been praying that He would send one of His angels to spare us. In spite of myself, the lump returned to my throat and the tears welled up in my eyes again. I'd never thought of Pa in those exact terms before. But after Widow Jensen mentioned it, I could see that it was probably true. I was sure that a better man than Pa had never walked the earth. I started remembering all the times he'd gone out of his way for Ma and me and many others. The list seemed endless as I thought on it. Pa insisted that everyone try on the shoes before we left. I was amazed when they all fit, and I wondered how he had known what sizes to get. Then I guessed that if he was on an errand for the Lord, that the Lord would make sure he got the right sizes. Tears were running down Widow Jensen's face again when we stood up to leave. Pa took each of the kids in his big arms and gave them a hug. They clung to him and didn't want us to go. I could see that they missed their pay, and I was glad that I still had mine. At the door, Pa turned to Widow Jensen and said, "The missus wanted me to invite you and the children over for Christmas dinner tomorrow. The turkey will be more than the three of us can eat. And a man can get cantankerous if he has to eat turkey for too many meals. We'll be by to get you about 11. It's nice to have some little ones around again. Matt here hasn't been little for quite a spell. I was the youngest. My 2 brothers and 2 sisters had all married and had moved away. Widow Jensen nodded and said, "Thank you, Brother Miles." I don't have to say. May the Lord bless you. I know for certain that he will. Out on the sled, I felt a warmth that came from deep within, and I didn't even notice the cold. When we had gone a ways, Pete turned to me and said, "Matt, I want you to know something. Your ma and me have been tucking a little money away here and there all year, so we could buy that rifle for you. But we didn't have quite enough. Then yesterday, a man who owed me a little money from years back came by to make things square. Your ma and me were real excited, thinking that now we could get you that rifle, and I started into town this morning to do just that. But on the way, I saw little Jakey out, scratching in the woodpile with his feet wrapped in those gunny sacks, and I knew what I had to do. Son, I spent the money for shoes and a little candy for those children. I hope you understand." I understood, and my eyes became wet with tears again. I understood very well, and I was so glad Pa had done it. Now the rifle seemed very low on my list of priorities. Pa had given me a lot more. He had given me the look on Widow Jensen's face and the radiant smiles of her 3 children. For the rest of my life, whenever I saw any of the Jensens or split a block of wood, I remembered. And remembering brought back that same joy I felt riding home beside Pa